Welcome to episode 53 of the Filmumentaries podcast. Thanks for joining me again. This is Jamie Benning talking to you from here in Britannia. That's relevant. The sun is out, summer is in full swing here. Today is actually the hottest day of the year so far. It was my birthday a couple of days ago, so thanks to you that sent me birthday wishes. It's very much appreciated. It appears that I'm one of those people that it's difficult to buy for, so aged 47, I got no gifts whatsoever. Actually, the following day I did get from my sister in the States some Lucasfilm 50th anniversary toys that she found in a local Target. She's very good at that. She knows what I like. I'll probably sell them in 10 years when they're worth more. Thank you, Nicola. This episode is a bit later into the month than usual. That's because my family and I managed a holiday to Europe earlier in June. And we've also had family visiting from the States, family we've not seen in about 4 or 5 years. So we've been making the most of that. But rest assured, there will be another episode in June 2022 as per your expectations. Anyway, thanks for joining me again, or for the first time perhaps. And if you are new to the podcast, there are 52 episodes for you to check out. There's no particular order to listen to them in, but there are a couple of two-parters. So obviously you want to listen to the first part of those. Otherwise it won't make a huge amount of sense. Thanks to the now 101 of you that support the podcast on patreon.com. Seem to have lost 2 of you since the last episode. That's fine, I understand. I hope that's not a reflection on how you felt about the podcast. But thanks for your support, and I wish you well. If you would like to help support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Jamie Benning. That's JamieBenning. So for about $12 or whatever your currency is, you could help me in the production of 24 episodes of the podcast for 1 year. Or you can pay monthly, you can pay yearly, and also check out, there are different tiers, and there are different goodies available depending on what tier you're in. Talking of goodies, you can now also buy a Filmumentaries podcast t-shirt from Teespring. That's TEESPRING.com. In fact, there's also an Inside Jaws one and an Inside Jabba the Hutt one with great illustrations from my pal Pete Starling. And there's even a podcast tote bag. So if you don't want to do the Patreon route, you could help support the podcast by doing that. And, all of this support will be pumped straight back into the podcast for research materials, hosting, marketing, etc. If you can't help in that way, please do share, leave a comment or review, and let your film-loving friends know about the podcast's existence. This is totally independent. It is literally just me. Here I am in my little, we call it an office, but it's just kind of a spare room. It's just me, my mic, my laptop, and a guest or guests. But thanks again for all of the help in whatever form it comes. I do really appreciate it. So for this episode, I have a returning guest. Last time I spoke to John Spira, who had directed Elstree 1976. He came on to talk about his documentary about British stuntmen and women in Hollywood Bulldogs. And he's back to talk about his new series, which is streaming on BritBox right now, namely Real Britannia. John has written and directed this, and it's great. I've really enjoyed it. I've been fortunate enough to watch the first 3 episodes before I spoke to John, and the 4th episode is just being finished up, as you'll hear him mention in our conversation. I'll post links to all of John's work in the show notes so you can check it out. So here's my conversation with documentary director and writer John Spira, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on.
How do you define British cinema?
It's about Britain, made by British people.
It springs from the culture, stories, and way of life in these islands.
Its landscape, language, character, quite distinct character.
That reflects who we are for generations to come.
It's tricky to define, but undeniable. These are the homegrown stories that became global hits. Real Britannia, a modern history of British cinema. Streaming 9th of June, only on BritBox.
John, we spoke some months ago about your documentary regarding stunt performers, and you sort of hinted then that you were working on a new series. How did it come about, and how long has this project taken, and where are you now?
The way it came about was kind of through a few different things, really. I mean, that's what tends to happen with these projects, is that when you make films, you kind of have a lot of things kind of in the ether, and a lot of projects that you would like to do, or a lot of kind of subjects that you'd like to cover, and certain circumstances kind of tend to bring them together. So with this one, I mean, I've always always been fascinated by British cinema history. So there was always a dream of doing something bigger. And now I've done kind of 3 feature films. There is something quite limiting about the kind of 90-minute to kind of, 2-hour documentary format. And while you're editing those films, you're very aware of that. So I've always kind of I've certainly had a growing desire to work in TV and to do something which is a series. So that's kind of all in the background. What happened was I was in a car with my producer Hank, and he works on kind of various different projects with different people. I'm the only person who he really works on projects with from the beginning to the very end. But he tends to kind of do post-production with people or help people get set up in production and that kind of thing. And I asked him what he was up to, and he said that he was working with someone and they were licensing the rights to Michael Dealey's life. Do you know Michael Dealey?
Yeah, Michael Dealey, yeah, of course, yeah. Producer.
So Dealey produced, The Italian Job and Wicker Man and Blade Runner and kind of The Man Who Fell to Earth. Really big films. And I, in my arrogance, said to Hank, he's not a terribly interesting guy. I'd actually interviewed him before, and I'd researched him before. And he's a lovely guy, don't get me wrong. But I always found that he was someone who he happened to be in the right place at the right time a little bit. I didn't feel like he was particularly a creative steer on any of those films. He just kind of was on those films. And also, if you're a fan of The Wicker Man, there's kind of a built-in mistrust of Michael Dealey, because Robin Hardy hated him and blamed him for losing so much of the footage and for kind of butchering the first cut of The Wicker Man. So I kind of said, hey, wow, he's not, I don't know if he'd be such an interesting subject, kind of in that way. And Hank said, well, what I really want to do is do a British version of Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. And again, in my arrogance, I said to him, well, you don't get to do that with anyone apart from me. I was like, that I would knock that out of the park. So if you change it into that, I'm on that. That's done. So he kind of agreed with that. And I think we might have put some people's nose out of joint, because I think he might have mentioned that to some people at some point as well. But whatever. That was kind of in the past. When we finished Hollywood Bulldogs, we sold it to BritBox in the UK for streaming rights. And within kind of a very short time of it being on their platform, they basically got in touch with us and said, what do you want to do next? So we said, we've got some ideas. We've got some ideas, certainly. And they were just very keen. They basically kind of said, well, whatever it is, we want to know. Tell us as quickly as possible, because we are commissioning stuff right now. So we decided we were going to pull together some of your British cinema history and a series. It seemed like the perfect chance to do a series. And it very quickly turned into a far more ambitious project. And the reason for that was that you couldn't really do a British Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, because there wasn't that connection between the filmmakers and the stars. It wasn't like a community. Like that book and that documentary worked really well because all those people knew each other and they all inspired each other and they all kind of drove each other on. And it was a very intense period of time, which was just the kind of late 60s, early 70s. And you could turn that into a story. And you couldn't do that with British cinema. British cinema was always more disparate than that. It really was people socializing and working together in that kind of way. So what interested me was doing the modern history of British cinema, which is much more about kind of saying, why, when I watch black and white films from kind of the 50s back, are they so different to films that I see today? Like, what changed that? And that's what I wanted to explore, and that's the story I wanted to tell. And really, that started bang on in 1960. That really started in 1959 with Room at the Top. And, you look at British cinema, and actually you go, every single decade moved on and was so different from the decade before. From the 60s to the 90s, almost into the 2000s, there was complete innovation in each decade. Each decade feels completely different. So that's what I wanted to do. That was the story I wanted to tell. I had a pretty good grasp of why that was and what had happened. But then it was just time to really kind of go for it. So BritBox said yes, which was great. They fully funded the production, which was amazing. And we kind of started, we pitched it last July. And the aim was probably to spend 18 months to 2 years on it. And then BritBox got back in touch and basically said, we still want to do it, but it has to be completed by May.
Mm-hmm.
And this was kind of just after the summer. And there was a moment where me and Hank really just had to kind of say, well, that's completely impossible, but we're never going to get this opportunity again. Because what BritBox offered us was not just the finance, but something which is very rare. Actually, I shouldn't say they offered the finance. What the deal was a commitment to buy once it was finished.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But what they offered us was incredibly rare, which was really no involvement whatsoever. They said you have final cut as long as it comes in, as long as every episode is over 60 minutes, as long as it's delivered on time. We trust you completely. They did not ask to see scripts, and they didn't see scripts, in fact. They did not ask to see rough cuts. We showed them rough cuts because actually the commissioning guys at BritBox are lovely, and they're so enthusiastic and they're so supportive that we actually kind of brought them in. We wanted to be involved and to be a bit more involved in that way. But they certainly didn't give any kind of editorial notes on it. They just said, this is great. We're really looking forward to seeing the rest of it. So it was this opportunity, and it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really do something we were passionate about and to do it in exactly the way we wanted to do it.
That's got to be super rare.
So rare.
I mean, having done the Hollywood Bulldogs, they must have just decided to put their trust in you guys because they were, aware of the quality of the production you could put together. Obviously, putting this very difficult calendar in front of you. How daunting was it? And how many of the films? You said you had some awareness of the kind, good awareness of the history, but how much do you think you found out upon the way? I mean, were there films that surprised you that you'd not seen before? I realise I've just asked you about 10 questions there, John. Go with the last one.
Yes, there were films that surprised me. Definitely films that surprised me. It was amazing. I mean, it was heaven for me. I mean, I certainly found that it was quite nice to realise that I did have a good grasp on it. And that most of the story that we were going to tell, I was aware of the films. There were certainly some films I hadn't heard of at all. And seeing those was amazing. I mean, I really discovered, I'm trying to think what the big films would be. In the 60s episode, Charlie Bubbles. Have you ever heard of Charlie Bubbles?
I hadn't, no. I was, just before we started recording, we were just chatting briefly, weren't we? And I said to you that one of the things it's made me want to do watching these first 3 episodes is just go and see not only the movies that I've already seen again, but then hunt out some of these other movies that I had no idea existed. And Charlie Bubbles was certainly one of those.
Totally. I mean, my dad's a complete cineast, and he's obviously from that generation. But, I was constantly phoning him going, have you heard of this film? And he was like, oh, yeah, of course I have. I saw it when it came out. But they faded into obscurity very quickly. And in fact, that's one of the things that I found out. One of the things I really found out making this is a hallmark of British cinema is how fucking ephemeral it is. Yeah. It just, for some reason, Hollywood films, maybe there's more money put into the marketing at the beginning of it or when they come out of video or whatever, and maybe there's just more people have seen them, but British cinema tends to just vanish. People don't talk about it. It's brilliant films which might have come out to great reviews, but if they didn't become classics, they really just kind of vanished into obscurity.
Yeah, so, I did notice actually that during watching it, some of the films look absolutely stunning, as if you're watching them, brand new. Obviously they're recent transfers on Blu-ray, and there were some other films that were of a different quality. Were they hard to find, some of these movies?
Were they hard to find? We were not really. So most stuff was at least available on DVD.
Right.
And we work with a great company called Film Shed, a great guy called Pat Winterskill, who is, he does our grading for us. And he managed to get DVD looking really good.
Great.
If it was already on Blu-ray or if there was an HD transfer, then, that was going to look good anyway. There was some stuff. So basically, like, we had a really good arrangement with the BFI where they gave us great access to the archive. And John Carino and Kev Gately at the BFI were really into the project. They were really kind of passionate about it. So if there were films we really couldn't get hold of, they usually could get hold of them.
Nice.
In fact, we've kind of, I don't want to go all out and say we've discovered a film, because I'm not sure that's entirely true. It feels like that. There's, in the second episode, while I was doing some reading, I kept coming across mentions of this film called A Private Enterprise, which I'd never heard of. And it's basically the first ever British Asian film. And it's about an Indian immigrant in Birmingham and how he gets on with life in Britain. I think it was probably in 1972 or 74. And that had never come out on VHS, never come out on DVD, never come out on Blu-ray. So they looked for it in the BFI archive. They had it because actually the BFI, I think, might have part funded it. And when they discovered it, there's now talk of doing a proper restoration on it, because it's actually a very important film, social history-wise. So that was one of the joys of this project. Actually, I feel like that was the one film which we really did have to search for and pulled out of complete obscurity, and hopefully now people will take a look at that.
I think that's important that as part of the documentary, isn't it, to you clearly as director and writer, that you wanted to show these films that cause these big social changes. I mean, I think it was it Victim that helped change the law on homosexuality?
Absolutely.
I mean, incredible to think that, we look at films now in a very sort of popcorny way, I think, particularly in our generation growing up in the 80s and 90s, but these films really did make a big change and should be preserved and should be presented. And one of the things I was going to ask you is, have you a full list of all the films that you show throughout the series? Because I'd like to start working my way through it.
Well, actually, if you just watch the end credits, and I think I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure we just use the roller of all the films on every episode. So all you have to do is go through the end credits and it'll list every single film that's in there.
Great.
It's a long watch, the end credit.
Did you watch all of the movies?
Well, I would say that I didn't watch the movies that I was confident in terms of having seen in the last few years and knowing well. The films that I had not seen, I certainly watched, and the films that I felt I needed to catch up with, I watched. So, yeah, I mean, this has been, we pitched it and they said yes in July. It took a while for the contract to get kind of finalised and signed, but I'd said to Hank, I need to start on this right away, or the research of this. There's no point waiting for it to be signed. And also, we kind of felt that, like, by the time we had a kind of, it's called a deck, but a document which managed the whole thing. I kind of felt like if they were going to pass, we would have just taken it somewhere else at that point. So it was worth doing. So I started in July, and I didn't really stop. I just carried on working the whole way through. So yeah, I watched a lot of films.
I do like the opening of the first episode, which tackles the 60s, but there's that kind of introduction to your audience out there, kind of saying the British cinema is kind of undefinable in a way, but just look how many British actors and directors have made or starred in your favourite movies throughout the decades. That was a nice little touch. And then that first episode, you've interviewed these heroes of filmmaking: David Lean, Stephen Frears, Mike Leigh, Ken Loach, David Putnam. That's the episode 1. I mean, was that a real buzz for you to go and be able to talk to these guys?
Oh my God, I couldn't believe it. I mean, like, we went into this. We didn't sign the deal with the BFI until really late on in post-production, really. So we didn't go to any of these people saying this is a BFI co-production. we just approached them, and Hank is a character, and he's a very nice man, really, and he's someone who can talk to people. So really, Hank spent a long time talking to their agents and their representatives and explaining what we were trying to do with this. So they responded to it, and it was just amazing. I mean, I couldn't believe the names he was getting. And I don't really get nervous before interviews. And I don't think I really got nervous on these ones. But I was certainly kind of confused as to how we had got such an incredible slate of interviewees. And as they started walking through the door, because we had to, the budget was not great on this series. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it was like stingy, but budgets are tight. So when it came to filming, we were doing 3 interviews a day.
Right.
Really long days of interviews. And, so you're getting 3 of these people walking through, 3 legends a day walking through the door. And it's weird. But it was great. And, there's a couple in there. Stephen Frears, I'd interviewed Stephen Frears before, I'd interviewed Mike Lee before. And they are famously kind of prickly interviews. And so I wouldn't say I was worried, but I was certainly wary. I was concerned that we wouldn't necessarily get from them what we wanted. And also, this is the first time. It's so different to the films that I've made before, where it was all of those films were kind of subject based, like the interviewees were the point of the film.
Yes.
So I would spend hours and hours interviewing them, and with these guys, really, I only had an hour and a half or that kind of amount of time, 2 hours. So I was concerned about whether I would get what I needed in time. And I was concerned about it being slightly rude, having a list, having an agenda in that way. That's not how I ever. So, but it worked really well. And the thing that was amazing was they, and I've known this from past interviews, so it shouldn't have surprised me, but the 2 rules to kind of really being able to do interviews, to be able to interview well, and this, is firstly to have done your homework, because that's polite, to have researched anyone you're asking for an interview. And secondly, to approach them on a level, to not be in awe of them, to not be kind of toadying, anything like that. You treat them as an absolutely normal human being. And then firstly, they can't really get away with bad behavior. And secondly, they actually respect you right from the get-go. Because you're not saying, oh, it's such a joy that you're here. Oh, I love your work. All of that kind of thing. You're not being deferential to them. You're just being respectful to them as you would another person. So it worked really well. It worked really well. And for me, I started kind of going to the BFI, National Film Theatre, when I was a kid with my dad, like Museum of the Moving Image, all of that stuff. So for me, the thing that was interesting was that David Putnam was a really big figure of my kind of teenage. I used to read his books and read all the interviews with him, and he was very present in the late 80s and the kind of early 90s. And then he kind of disappeared. You don't really see him interviewed anymore. He just kind of seemed to leave that whole thing. And it was very gratifying to interview him, and for him to very quickly kind of be like, okay, this is great, you know what you're talking about, so we can talk about this in detail. I don't have to educate you on this stuff, so actually we can have quite a meaty conversation. And when it comes to kind of episode 3, the kind of 1980s, a lot of that story is about the business side of British cinema. And it was good to be kind of very well versed in that as well, because otherwise, that's the kind of stuff that could turn people off a bit, even though it's really interesting. But it meant that he didn't have to kind of dumb down for me. I knew the people he was talking about, I knew the situations he was talking about, and I could ask kind of intelligent questions about them, which made him happy and made him give us far more interesting stuff back.
Nice. I mean, that is what happened in the 80s, wasn't it? That changing landscape of the big companies, the big studios, that kind of changed hands, and Thatcher taking away the tax incentives and all of that kind of stuff. So the business is a part that really has to be tackled, because that's what set the scene for some of those movies, and hence why the movies once again changed again, from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. And it's amazing to see the difference, isn't it? And the sort of cultural milestone throughout those different decades. I was sort of chuckling away to myself because it is a comedic series as well at points, isn't it? I mean, you've
That's
got
very important to say, actually. Yeah.
you've got Nick Helm doing as narrator, and he does a good job of kind of guiding us through it. And I think the 80s episode is probably where he gets to kind of flourish. Your writing really comes through for a comedian there.
Well, he was, excuse me, I have the post-production cough right now, which is that we're now just finishing episode 4. So I've got really ill because my adrenaline has dropped. Nick Helm was really important. So there were a couple of things that I put in place, because when you sit down and you say, I'm going to tell a version of history of like 5 decades, you have to put parameters in. Otherwise you go insane. You have to put rules in as to what gets included and how things are done. Otherwise you can't nail it down. So I spent a lot of time doing that really before I started writing. And there were 2 things that were really important to me. The first was that it was authored. And because I had Final Cut, and because no one was gonna have a say, and I wasn't gonna have to justify stuff, I wanted to. Felt like my one chance to do a truly authored piece of work in my voice, which means I get to say, I'm telling you this story from my point of view. And in fact, by the time you get to episode 4, I think we're going to get a lot of pushback on that episode, because by then I'm quite angry. I feel that what happened after the year 2000 to British cinema is something not to be particularly proud of. And I think we're still in a pretty shitty place with British cinema.
Yeah.
So I don't hold back. And I'm interested to see what happens with the response to that, because I wouldn't say I name and shame, but I certainly name the people who I think are responsible for this. And, there's a lot of anger directed towards Richard Curtis and Working Title and all the people who have formulated films and changed British cinema into a formula. And so I wanted to be able to do that. The style that I wanted to talk in was really how I talk anyway. And I just thought it would be great. I've done all these video essays for like Blu-rays and stuff. And I've realized that whenever I do those, I use my own voice, but I put on a kind of slightly posher voice, and I take on a kind of authoritarian or an authoritative voice, And I realized that what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk as if we were in a pub. And you had just said to me, I don't like black and white films. And I was 2 pints in, and I was like, right, you listen to me. I am going to tell you why you should like black and white films. And just like a pub conversation, you've had these, about movies with film fans. You go, no, this is shit. You should be watching this. You should watch this. And by the way, have you ever heard of this? So I wanted to be like a guy in a pub kind of holding court, just kind of going, look, this is how it is. This is my opinion. You can argue with me if you like. There's a bit in episode 4, I think, where Nick literally goes, and I scripted it obviously, but he literally goes, I think it's the section about the full Monty, and I basically say, I write what I believe, which is the Full Monty is the most perfect British film ever made. And I'm not saying it's my favourite film, and I'm not saying it's the best film. I'm saying it's the most perfect film. And then I just had Nick say, disagree all you want, I will fight you on this, and I will win. So it's that kind of tone. And partially, and I love that, and I'm really happy. And Helm was the person I always wanted to do the voice. He'd never done a voiceover before. And he absolutely nails it. There's so much fun. And he's got his own film podcast, and he loves movies. And so he brought absolute A game to a lot of passion and stuff. But the other thing that was important to me personally was, you'll remember that there was a TV show in the late 80s, early 90s called Movie Drone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hosted by Alex Cox and then my cousin. And in that show, they would introduce 1 or 2 films on, I guess it was BBC Two, I think, that the channel would then show. So they were just introductions to films, and the introductions were like 15 minutes long. But the tone of the introduction, especially with Alex Cox, he was like a big brother. He'd go, all right, so tonight we're going to watch this film. Here's a little bit about the filmmaker. Here's things to look for in the film. Here's why it's important. And there's even, I mean, I watched them all. They're all on YouTube. They're worth watching. And I watched them all again, like while I was working on this. And there's a great one where he's introducing Escape from New York, and he literally just goes, "I don't think this is a great film." Like, you know, I don't think this is a great film. This is not one of John Carpenter's best. But since we're on the subject, let's talk about John Carpenter. And what those films did for me in my teenage is immeasurable. You know, I knew that if I watched that, I would see one or two films that were worth watching. And that was curation, you know, at its most pure form. And that's what I wanted this series to be. That is the guiding light for this series, is that I really would like younger people to watch it, or people who have a great passion for film, but maybe don't have the confidence to kind of access areas of it that they haven't really done before, or really know how to access it. I wanted it to be a fun, big brotherly, good friend, authoritative voice who would just put an arm around the shoulder and just go, check these films out. You are going to love them.
Yeah, my daughter, who's 16, she's currently doing her GCSE. She wants to do film studies A-level, and she's got a place at college, hopefully, where she'll be able to do that. And I'm going to show her this straight away because I think maybe her generation, maybe slightly older, there's a slight embarrassment almost about British movies because they've got this particular feel now that they kind of blend into one for me, to be honest. And I think to look back at, you know, the kind of punk era and the early British horror stuff, and, you know, even those crazy sex comedies and things you talk about in the 70s episode, and then through onto the 80s where the whole financial and studio landscape changed. I think it's a great educational piece as well, John. I think that's surely a very gratifying part of what you do, you know, not only there for movie fans, but there for people who are just discovering this stuff for the first time.
Yeah, and it's really important to me. I mean, I used to teach, you know, various things about film, you know, screenwriting and film studies, that kind of thing. And one of the things that I learned as a teacher very quickly, for me at least, is that you have to talk to people on the level. You have to be yourself, and people learn better if you're not pretending to be highfalutin. So I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this series from different quarters, you know, because it is controversial because it takes a stand. But what does that these days? You know, what is authoritative in that kind of way?
Yeah,
things don't have the confidence anymore. You know, they treat the audience like idiots, and they treat the subject with, you know, I feel like I've seen documentaries. I've never seen actually a documentary about the history of British cinema, so that kind of had to happen. But when I watch documentaries about kind of like cinema history, I mean, you know, I think we might have discussed this before, but like that fucking show, the movie, like it drives me insane. It treats everyone like idiots, and even the interviewees, they get these great directors on there, and they just, you know, make them look really fucking stupid and banal, you know.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, it's two things. It's like, you shouldn't be ashamed to hide your intelligence. Like, there aren't a lot of very intelligent TV shows out there. So firstly, like, don't be ashamed about kind of hiding your intelligence. Do a piece of work which doesn't treat people like idiots and challenges them to a point. But then also, don't fucking pretend you don't take yourself seriously in that way. Have fun with it, and it just could be great. And so this was an experiment in tone, and Hank backed me up, which was amazing. There have been points before it came out, there were points where I was just like, what are we doing? Like, this is so, I don't want to say like it's radical, like we're doing something revolutionary, but it's so not the norm. Like, what are people going to make of this? And I had this huge panic about 2 weeks before episode 1 aired, which was, we've worked on them pretty much chronologically through post-production. So episode 1 was the first, you know, to be kind of pretty much out the door. And I hadn't looked at it for the best part of 2 months, maybe, when we were getting it ready to send to BritBox. And I watched it back, and I just said, I watched the first 5 minutes, and I stopped it, and I said to my wife, I think I've done something really fucking stupid. And she was like, what? And I said, I've opened the whole series. Literally, the opening of the series is a series of shots which I put in originally temporarily to make me laugh. And I don't know if anyone will spot this, but it opens on library footage of the Hollywood sign and of stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So I downloaded from the library site, tons of footage. And just as placeholders to make me laugh, the three signs on the Hollywood Walk of Fame that I put on were Lassie, Tim Allen, and Jerry Bruckheimer. Yeah. And the reason I put Jerry Bruckheimer is because there's a dog shit on his name. So it literally just made me laugh. I never thought about it again. I just accepted it as part of the thing. And I was just like, am I an idiot? Like, people are going to look at this and just be like, why have they can't be serious about this because that's Tim Allen.
I did notice it, I have to say, and I said to my wife at the time, because I'd recently been out to LA and walked down that very strip, and there was William Shatner's star with a dog shit on it as well. I took a picture of it, and you just think all these people are coming to worship their idols, and they haven't even cleaned the street, and I did notice that, and I did chuckle, and I think it sets the tone really well, though, having the kind of the stock footage of the Hollywood sign and everything, because it's immediately swept to the side, and it says, right, now we're in Britain. Okay, Hollywood influences throughout those decades, and there are crossovers, but we're firmly, rooted into the British way of things.
Totally. There's actually, my favourite part of the whole series, like if I had to choose a favourite moment, is the very beginning of episode 4. Because when I got to that point, I knew I'd told the story pretty well. But what I hadn't nailed down or even really started to think about was what's the difference between a Hollywood movie and a British movie? Because there is one. Like, we know there is one. British movies feel different. It's that's just the truth. There were some points in the 90s, notably the emergence of Danny Cannon, Paul W.S. Anderson, and Richard Stanley. They were 3 filmmakers who actually tried to make American multiplex films in this country. Mm. And after their first films, they all went to America, and so it didn't continue. It's a very short thing. But I really wanted to kind of explore what the difference was. And I realized that Ghost and Truly Madly Deeply were released in the same year. And they're essentially the same film. And so the first kind of it might even be as much as kind of 8 minutes of the 4th episode is forensic in comparing those 2 films and saying that because they're kind of the same story and the same concept, you can actually use that to work out what the difference is between Hollywood and Britain. And I'm certainly not, the great thing is that Ghost is a really good film. Mm. There'll be people who'll pan Ghost, but the truth is that was written by Bruce Joel Rubin, who's an incredible screenwriter. And it's a really good film. I'll stand by Ghost, and I love Truly Madly Deeply. That's always been one of my favorite films. Mm-hmm. So to be able to take 2 films and not be like, oh, look at the shitty Hollywood one and look at the classic, British one, to look at 2 films side by side and be able to kind of take them apart and compare them and say, well, here lies the difference, was a really kind of satisfying exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember Truly Madly Deeply very well. And Ghost is actually edited, of course, by Walter Murch.
Of course.
A guest on this very podcast, which still amazes me to this day. But a lot of these films, particularly in the 80s episode, and I'm sure when I get to the 90s episode, it'll be the same. They're very formative films for me. I had a TV in my room. My parents allowed me to have a little 14-inch CRT TV then, and some of these movies I was staying up later than I should have to watch them. So there was a kind of added jeopardy to watching some of them that might have scenes in them that weren't particularly appropriate for a 13, 14, 15-year-old boy. I'm looking forward to revisiting them and seeing what kind of feelings emerge, Did you have a similar relationship with those movies, having watched them, or were they more, your dad guiding you through what you should watch and him curating them for you?
I actually had both really. Dad certainly curated stuff for me when I was younger, and then when I got a TV in my room, I was 13 when I first got a TV in my room,
Yeah.
and yeah, exactly the same experience. And in fact, exactly what you were saying. For me, the films that I saw that were really unsuitable were the Peter Greenaway films,
Yeah.
which were real headfuck to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was so much violence and nudity in them, but they were also so I don't want to just say artistic, but the way he composed his frames looks like each frame looks like a painting.
Yeah.
And actually that freaked me out a lot more than catching the odd kind of slasher movie.
They felt kind of, I don't know, I knew I shouldn't be watching them. Like, you know, my parents would have forbidden me from watching them, but I found them kind of, I don't know, there was this certain pull to them. Like, you just couldn't believe quite what you were seeing because it was like nothing else. You know, TV throughout the day was just the same. You know, it was news at certain hours, it was kids' TV shows, it was, you know, John Craven's News Round, then it was like an Australian soap maybe. And then by the time you got 10 o'clock and you turned on Channel 4, it was like, holy shit, what the hell is this thing that I'm watching?
Yeah.
I remember seeing...
Sorry, Karen.
I was going to say, I remember seeing, I don't know if it was Drowning by Numbers or if it was then or if it was later on, or it might have been The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, I don't know. But I certainly saw those films at some point and had a real change in perspective on movies. You know, Channel 4 introduced me to so many different directors because they used to do these series of, you know, we're going to cover a certain, let's say Scorsese or something and show all his movies. And I discovered cinema really on a 14-inch TV thanks to Channel 4.
And they also did, I mean, like, I remember they did, I dread to think how old I was, but they did like a season about band cinema.
Yes,
you know,
they did,
and they
yeah.
showed really kind of visual documentaries about sex and things like that. And I remember seeing a lot of stuff that really kind of shook me and challenged me and stuff. So yeah, I mean, I've got to be honest actually with the Greenaway films, I didn't rewatch them like in their totality. I was kind of like watching bits and skipping through it. And part of that is because they still freak me out.
Yeah, me too.
It surprised the hell out of me. But Drowning by Numbers is such a fucking unsettling film to watch. It's yeah. And I was so surprised to see a Z and Two Noughts and see that like Jim Davidson was like the star of it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? All these people that, you know, I'm sure American people listening to this podcast, apparently my biggest listenership is in California, but I'm sure they won't know some of the names we've mentioned here, but I urge you to watch John's series. But yeah, I was surprised by some of the comedians, people I knew as comedians, people I knew as TV stars kind of popping up in these movies.
Just, you know, like the cast of Harry Potter, you know.
Oh yeah.
There and everything, and Helen Mirren, who's a, you know, very respected. It's bizarre to see them in those films.
Yeah, it really is. It was funny. Going back to my kids again, they've kind of discovered other movies backwards from Harry Potter. You know, you look at all those people who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s in those movies, and they suddenly go, "Hang on a minute, that's Professor McGonagall."
Yeah.
or it's Dumbledore, and I really like that. You know, that they're finding their own way through these films, albeit in a strange order. But you know, I arrived to movies, you know, as I said, in the late 70s and early 80s, and I didn't go back any further than that until I was, I guess, in my very late teens and early 20s. Yeah, I'm really. It's going to cost me a bloody fortune, John, but I'm going to go back and watch a lot of these. Maybe the BFI player is the way to go.
Well, actually, BritBox is the way to go because they've licensed loads of these films.
Great.
They're supporting us so much that they've put Real Britannia. It's now on the front page of BritBox, and they've programmed a thing called the Summer of Film. And they asked us for the lists of everything we've put in, and they've licensed as much of it as they can. And they found some really rare, great stuff.
Brilliant.
So chances are, you watch it on BritBox, just have a look afterwards and see if the films are there, because a lot of them are.
I think BritBox, I mean, my sister lives in the States. She lives out in Texas, and She's married to an American, and she has BritBox, and I would imagine there's quite a big audience in the US for BritBox. And at some points, did you feel like you had to... How much did you feel like you had to explain to people? I mean, there's that one point where you talk about the carry-on films, and there is an entire generation, my kids included, that wouldn't even know what a carry-on movie is. How much of a... how often did you come across a situation where you thought, I need to explain this a little bit more in case there's an audience that is completely unaware of it as a cultural touchstone?
It's so funny you mentioned that. We've the only annoying thing that's happened in this week when the first episode came out is we got fantastic reviews from everybody. It was really great. But the fucking Telegraph gave us a shit review.
Really?
And the person who reviewed it, she gave us 5 out of 5 for Bulldogs, which I don't even think, I love Bulldogs, but I don't think that's 5 out of 5 films. So when I read that, I was like, she might be a bit mad. But when I read the review is titled, "Does BritBox really think we don't know what the carry-on films are?"
Really?
Yeah. So the whole premise of the review is like, fuck off. We know what a carry-on film is. Don't patronize us. And I'm like, you haven't watched the fucking series, clearly, because we don't patronize anyone. The carry-on films is a 20-second montage, which is started by the words, "Oh, and if you don't know what a carry-on film is, here we go." And it's a really fast montage, and it ends with the words, "But we don't like to talk about them anymore."
Well, yeah, I mean, they really have been buried, haven't they? By
you said, there is a whole generation. There's more than one generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say anyone under 30, probably hasn't fucking seen one. And I just find it insane that that's considered.
Why did they decide to focus on that? I mean, I did also hear your the review on Mark Kermode's new show as well, and that was very positive.
That was great.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been nice, because, I mean, if for anybody, I'm doing it now, but for anybody who doesn't know who Mark Kermode is, he's one of the biggest movie reviewers in the UK. He's had a podcast and a radio show for years now, which has recently moved over to the Sony platform, I think, away from the BBC. But he's got a big following, and, he's very passionate about his movies, and he gave you a very good review, I thought. That must have been really nice.
That was lovely. I mean, that was amazing. But, I mean... yeah, it was great. I mean, we were surprised even to be reviewed by him, to be honest. So we were thrilled. And he actually sent a really nice message on Twitter as well. So
great.
My head was kind of spinning from that. But to answer the question you asked about kind of what I decided was worth explaining and not worth explaining, is while I was writing it, I didn't want to talk down to anybody. So I don't want to patronize and kind of go, "Oh, by the way, this is this." What I figure is everyone's got fucking Google, and if you get left behind, you pause and you Google it.
Yes.
All of the information is out there, and we do move at a fast pace. But if you're a basic, curious, intelligent person, and you don't understand what something is, you look it up.
Yeah.
So the way we did the carry-on films, to me, was exactly right, because we couldn't have done a documentary about the 1960s. Stroke 70s, 80s, 90s on British cinema and not mention them. That would be insane.
Of course. I mean, they kept a lot of people in work for a very long time. I mean, that last one was in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like 92.
Yeah.
but equally, the point of this series is the films that we cover either have to reflect what was happening in society or have moved society on or moved film culture on. And the truth is that the carry-on films didn't do that. They were just kind of there. They didn't really change anything. They were just lowest common denominator, kind of silly, end of the pier kind of films. You can't look at the carry-on films and say that they've inspired anything. We're not still doing that kind of comedy.
I think what you do really well in your writing is that you talk about these films that are important in terms of, social and cultural change or in whatever aspect, but you do it without being highfalutin, like you said. There's a lightness of touch as well that you have that makes me, as a member of the audience, kind of go, I want to know more about that. Or, oh yeah, I remember that movie. I liked it, disliked it, whatever. And then, as you said, it is fairly fast-paced because there's so much to cover.
Yeah.
But I think you do that really well. There's a good balance there. Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm worried about missing something important.
No, because
I'm not doubting you. I wondered
I
if
mean,
you ever doubted yourself.
I can. I mean, like I no, I researched it really kind of
Mm,
thoroughly, and also I worked with a brilliant curator from the BFI called Jo Botting,
hmm.
who she's just amazing, and she went over every script after I did it,
Great.
and just gave me kind of bits of advice. So she would say, "You should think about mentioning this person," uh, and she was good with that, and she was also good with kind of knocking off. There are points where I went too far with kind of being acerbic,
Hmm.
where she would say, actually, at this point, you're kind of coming off like an asshole.
Rein it in a
So,
bit, John.
reel that in a bit. Think about different ways of saying that kind of thing. One thing that I did not do that she advised me to do, which I do feel a little bad about, was not mentioning Pete Walker at all.
Mm.
And I felt, because I covered Norman J. Warren, I kind of went, I don't want to go into more of these exploitation films,
Hmm.
like that. I've covered it for the value it kind of had, but I do feel bad about that because he really was kind of a monumental figure, and he's someone who respect has grown for over time.
Mm.
So I do kind of looking back, wish I'd put in a little nod to kind of Pete Walker there.
Mm.
The only
Was it Frightmare that I'm thinking of that he directed?
Absolutely, yeah,
It's
and
one.
lots of those kind of films. But yeah, so that was kind of that was a bit like, she really fought for that, but there wasn't the time, and it just, that kind of fell by the wayside. The only significant film I feel I've missed out is Scum,
Mm.
and I tried to get that in, and I just couldn't quite make it work, because really the 70s and the 80s episodes, or certainly the 80s episode, and that was 79. The 80s episode is very focused on Thatcher, and Scum kind of slightly predates that.
It was right at the end of the 70s, wasn't it? Scum. Yeah.
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 So there wasn't quite a place for it in the 70s episode. And by the time you got to the 80s, you kind of go, well, we're talking about Thatcher, but really she wasn't the person who brought in the legislation that inspired Scum.
Mm.
So it's kind of, that was the only film which I still kind of go, fuck, I wish I'd kind of been able to find a place for it in there, because it is such an important film, but it just didn't quite work. And we had the same quandary at the end, and you see it at the end of the 60s with Ken Russell, where you go, well, Ken was working in the 60s, but his Ken Russell films were in the 70s.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
We've seen him before, but now we're going to talk about him. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I ended up dealing with that by just literally having Nick say, I'm too tired to talk about Ken Russell right now. We're coming to the end of the episode.
Yeah.
I do not have the energy to even start explaining Ken Russell to you.
Well, you need a whole episode.
Exactly. I mean, God, but that's true of all of these.
Yeah, it is.
That's kind of one of the frustrations of doing this is learning how to squish a film down without doing it a huge disservice. But also, like I say, being frustrated that you can't actually spend a bit more time really going into much more depth on certain films.
That would happen wherever you would stop, though. Ultimately, wouldn't it? There'd always be, a wish to include something else. These things have to be released at some point, don't they? And you had a deadline to meet, and I think you've done a very good job. I haven't watched episode 4 yet.
Well, episode 4 is not finished yet.
It's not finished.
I will send you a link as soon as that's finished.
That would be great. But also, without giving away too much, where do you kind of finish?
We finished in 2010, pretty much. Pretty much. There is, I won't give the ending away, but there is a film which, for me, when I first saw it, I thought it was a really important film. And surprisingly, it's a film that actually doesn't, when it came out, there was a bit of noise around it, but it doesn't get talked about as a classic at all. But for me, I found this one film which summed up all of British cinema. And because because our documentary starts in 1960 with the social realists and the dream that they had for cinema, which was basically making it representative of actual British society. So covering people who were working class, who were disabled, who were from ethnic minorities, all of these things. There was one film that came out, I think, in 2010, which for me did everything British cinema was working towards. It was representative, it was commercial, it was fun, but it was serious. It made a massive point politically.
I know which film it is, but I'm not going to say. But I actually saw it with the director over my shoulder.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah. I was talking about, if it is the film I'm thinking of, I was talking about this just the other day to a friend of mine and saying how, it doesn't really get talked about, but it's an incredible film. I hope it is the same one.
Should we say do an edit point so you take it out just to find out?
Go on.
What do you think it is? Yes, it is.
Hey, yeah. So I was at and they showed it there, and we were in this tent, and he just came and plonked himself behind us and just watched the audience reaction. And he disappeared about half an hour in, and then he came back kind of 25 minutes from the end. And I turned to him and I said, "Brilliant." He said, "Thank you," and walked off.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
He's a genius. He's a genius. So
totally.
Yeah, so it ends with that. But it also, let's edit back in. Part of the point of it is that I am very disillusioned with British cinema, and to me, there is great stuff being made, but it's not getting out there so much. And what happened in the kind of from the 1990s through to the 2000s was that a culture came about. I mean, you look at the 1980s episodes, you've got companies like Palace Pictures, Handmade Films, you've got Film 4, and they are just commissioning everything. They are looking for interesting people, and they're saying, go and make these interesting movies. People want to see interesting movies. Then what happened really, not to give too much of the story away, but really with Four Weddings and a Funeral, is that it became obvious that there was a place on the global stage for a certain type of British movie.
Yeah.
And we entered this awful stage of how production companies work, how all commissioning works, of justification. This is why I love BritBox and how they let us make this show. They just went, we love what you do, we trust you, bring us something. That's what used to happen with film and TV. From the 90s onwards, it stopped. And what happens now is justification. So if you want to get a film made, you have to basically prove in advance how it will make its money back. So you have to say, well, it'll have these stars, or it'll follow this formula because these films are really popular, you know? It's no coincidence that the bulk of films that come out of these aisles are period dramas, you know, or comedies about posh people, or films about groups of underdogs, you know, the full Monty model. So British cinema got very unadventurous, and really, actually, in the last 10 years, it's got a bit more adventurous, and it's got a bit more representative, and it's got a bit more interesting. But cinema has died in those 10 years. So although some interesting films are being made, you know, they're ending up on streaming platforms. It's not cinema, it's not the same. Like, it's, you know, so for me, I finished the story pretty much in the 2010s by saying, you know, that's the point at which we stopped throwing light through celluloid in a darkened room, you know, and anything beyond that is maybe postmodern cinema. You know, it's films which are on streaming platforms, and that's different. And you know, that's changing even for me. You know, I'm someone who's come up making feature documentaries and now a TV series. But really, the landscape is changing. I mean, the fact that BritBox are releasing it one episode a week, I think is great.
Yes.
Normally, these things just get dumped on streaming platforms.
Yeah, I much prefer the weekly release schedule because, you know, you can talk about it, you can digest it, you can look forward to it.
You can rewatch it. You can rewatch the episode, you know, for the next episode. So that's all changing. And, you know, even I've got a career firmly rooted in pop culture documentary. But if you look at what's happening with that now, you've got these, and I'm not denigrating them at all, but like it's interesting that now you're getting these Kickstarter documentaries, and I come from Kickstarter, you know, but they're literally 5 or 6 hour long documentaries.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not passing judgment on that at all. I just find it interesting because, you know, you in the past you could never have put one of those in the cinema because no cinema is going to book a 6 hour film. I guess a streaming platform they probably will, and I think a lot of film fans, that's what they want. They don't want to just kind of plow through extra features. You know, they love the idea of getting everything on screen, and that's radically different to how I was brought up as a filmmaker.
Yeah, well, there's this sort of completist attitude, isn't there, rather than the sort of sculpting and creating something that works.
Exactly that, and the thing that I find a bit strange, and again, I really am not denigrating it, but like, it's almost throw everything at the wall. Like when I look at the list of people who are interviewed on these films, it just feels like we got everyone we could get. Do you know what I mean? And you kind of go, imagine if you'd focused on 4 of these people and really kind of, I don't know, for me, I like although I've really enjoyed working in a longer format and being able to do kind of 4 hours as a series, it's still 4 separate episodes. And I really, you know, I was educated as an editor, and I like the idea of storytelling. I like the idea of crafting something out of it rather than just going, blam, here's all of the interviews, here's all of the footage, you know. But that doesn't mean I'm right. Audiences will, you know, I mean, those films get so well funded on Kickstarter. So it's clearly, audiences are clearly really into that. It's an evolution, you know, it's just changing.
It is. I'm dipping my toes into the world of documentary. I'm trying to get a kind of feature together at the moment. We've shot quite a lot of hours of interviews in a sort of completist way because we were there and we had a week and we thought we'd do as much as we can, and it's only now that we're kind of coming back and reviewing the footage and trying to craft something out of it. Ultimately it's not a best of, you know, it's it's something I want to make a story about. I want to make it a story about this particular person and why he's done these particular things and why he lives in a particular way. It's not just about, oh, I worked on this movie and then I worked on this movie and then I worked on that movie and then I retired, because that's not interesting to me. It may be a way to include all of it, but I don't think it's entirely necessary. No, I think you've done a real service to the British film industry and to, you know, the potential audience and the audience that kind of is already very rooted in that world, and someone like me who kind of grew up with a lot of these movies. It's really genuinely made me want to go and see so many of these films again and re-educate myself. And I'm really looking forward to episode 4.
That is the important thing. I'm really, really glad, especially for someone who knows and loves films like you do. It's to make people want to see films again is great. And the journey that of making this series, which has included rewatching films, has just been amazing, you know. And then getting to talk to people about these films, you know, it's something like Kes, you know, just, you know, you watch that film, every time you watch it, it blows you away. You forget how good it is, even though you kind of know. Same with Now and I, you know, they're films that you just, you know in your mind that they're great films, but then you stick them on and you go, oh my God, this is just incredible. So, yeah, no, it's just been amazing.
Hope you enjoyed my chat there with John Spira. John really has done a great job of this show, this history of British movies. I really do recommend you watch Real Britannia, but have a pad and a pen ready or your phone there, because you'll be wanting to note down a list of the films you'd like to watch. And as I said to John, I'm going to endeavour to watch a whole bunch of them again, and some for the first time in the coming weeks, months and probably years. It's a shame my birthday's just gone, actually, because I've now got a birthday list. People always struggle to buy for me. They don't know what I want, and they assume that anything I do want I've already bought. But yeah, this list will now form my Amazon birthday wish list. Thanks to John for giving his time to chat about this project, and I hope I can catch up with him in person a bit later in the year, and for any new projects that he's working on as well. So coming up on the podcast, I'm speaking to T. Dan Hofstede. Now, he's an animation supervisor. He worked on a whole bunch of Disney movies, including The Lion King, Mulan, Pocahontas, Hercules, Aladdin, Princess and the Frog, Hunchback of Notre Dame, An American Tale, a bunch of stuff. So I'm really looking forward to him because it's an area that I've not really delved into too much previously. I'm actually interviewing him today, and very much looking forward to that. And also on the podcast, we've got Daniel Pemberton. We still haven't figured out a date. One of the dates that we were going to do, unfortunately Daniel was jet lagged quite badly and wanted to shift it, and then I couldn't do those dates, but we will get there. I'm also hopefully being put in touch with Paul Houston, or XILM, and Jim Maxwell, previous guest, and I are lining up something quite interesting with two guys who I've spoken to previously, but we're going to do like a video podcast because we want to showcase their work. So that's going to be really fun as well. A big thanks to Michael Hewitt Brown of MB Music, that's EMBE music.co.uk, for the podcast theme. Give Mike a shout if you want music for your project. He's a great guy, he's a friend of mine, and he's a wonderful collaborator. He really does listen to what you want and comes forward with some great suggestions as well. Thanks for your support, thanks for listening, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.